Okay, so today is the second lecture about chapter 23, and it's going to cover two topics really: surrealism and the Nazis. So, we already talked a little bit about the Nazis before when we talked about censorship in art in the beginning of the course, but that all happened, but in the period between the wars in the 1930s. So we're going to kind of touch on it again, or sort of review it again. And I think you'll understand it better than the first time we talked about it, because now you know what Dada is, and soon you'll know what surrealism is. And those were some of the things that and abstraction and modernism generally. And those are the things that the Nazis really hated. But I also wanted to say that there's an extra credit assignment that you can do in the last week of classes, which is like November 30th through December 4th, the week before exam week. And that is, if you want to make a presentation about a contemporary artist, you can do that via Zoom and PowerPoint, just the same way that I'm doing it here. And, pick a time that's convenient for you, and I'll watch your presentation. It can be as long as you want it to be. I mean, normally when we do this, when we're in person, having in-person classes, is that everybody gets 7 to 10 minutes, and you can do it in a group, and you present to your class, and that's fun, and people have enjoyed that in the past. And it was an assignment that everybody had to do. But since we're not together in a classroom, I've made it kind of an optional assignment that you can do that can help your participation grade. So if you're worried about your participation grade, you can get up to 10 extra points on your average for your participation grade. So like if your average now is an 80, you could potentially raise it to a 90 if your presentation is really good. And, we can invite other people to view your presentation by Zoom if you want to, or you can just show it to me. So what is a contemporary artist? A contemporary artist is somebody who's still alive now. That's basically it. But I do make an exception for certain people who have died recently or whose art is still considered so influential in contemporary art that it seems reasonable. Like some people really wanted to present about Jean-Michel Basquiat, and he died, I think maybe 25 years ago, or more. But, he's still so important to contemporary art that I think that would be okay. There, in the content, there's a module that explains the assignment. So just go to that module, and you'll see a handout about the assignment and a link and some links to places on the internet where you can find a list of contemporary artists, especially at a site called art21.org. Or you can just look through your text, and not just the art history part of the text, obviously, the last chapter, which would be chapter 25, which is about contemporary art. But the first, I don't know, 14 chapters, I think, are about, art in general. And some of the artworks in the first 14 chapter are going to be old, but some of them are going to be contemporary. And you can just, if you see something you like, you can just look up the artist and see if they're still living. And if you have any questions about it, just email me and I'll tell you if that person is appropriate. Now, what doesn't work is to just Google contemporary art or contemporary artist, and you'll just come up with a bunch. Sometimes you just come up with a bunch of stuff on Etsy. So that's not going to be a good presentation. What you want is somebody who's sort of recognized in the art world, not somebody who just sells their paintings on Etsy. Not that those paintings are bad, necessarily, but you'll have more to talk about if you go with an artist who's kind of a recognized contemporary artist on the Art 21 site or in your text or on the Khan Academy site or something like that. Now, there's always somebody who wants to do a presentation about Alex Gray, and that's fine. I know who he is now. And if you have an idea about somebody that's not, in the text or not listed on the Art 21 site and you really want to present about them, just send me an email and I'll look that person up and see if it seems like something that would be enough material for you to make a good presentation. Again, this is not a requirement. It's for extra credit. If it were an in-person class, it would be a requirement. So maybe next fall we'll have school in person again and people will be able to do their presentation in person, which is always entertaining for everybody else. But we just have to do it online now. So now I'm going to do my presentation. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. All right. Nazi art, Nazi art, Nazi art. Okay, so today the topic is surrealism. Oh no, they've changed. Okay, here we go. I got a new computer with a new PowerPoint, so I have to figure it all out. Okay, so surrealism, there was a lot going on between the wars. I'm just reading in an art book about all the different art movements that were going on then. And Dada and Surrealism and Nazi art are not the only ones, obviously, but those are the things we're focusing on. So last time was about Dada, this time it's about Surrealism. So Surrealism kind of grew out of Dada, you could say. So you recall that Dada was a kind of reaction to the so-called rationality or reason-focused culture of Europe before World War I. And World War I kind of paid the idea that Europe was based on reason because World War I was crazy. A lot of people died for no real reason. And so artists and other thoughtful people suddenly went, oh, maybe we're not governed by reason and science and progress after all. Maybe unconscious forces are operating in our world in a way that we don't really understand. So that was sort of the origin of Dada, that art should reflect that. Art should be irrational, and like Duchamp's found objects, or what he called his ready-mades, and the crazy performances that seemed like nonsense that Hugo Ball did at the Cabaret Voltaire, all that stuff was about sort of irrationality and the unconscious maybe. But Dada didn't actually last that long. And it was succeeded by this art movement, Surrealism, which wasn't just about visual art. It wasn't even, at first, it wasn't about visual art. It was about poetry and literature and so on. But it gradually became a visual art movement, mainly because of André Breton, who wrote the Surrealist Manifesto in French. You can see. Now, this looks like it says soluble fish, and it could very well say that. Maybe, I don't know what that means. Maybe this is the publisher, or maybe it's just the subtitle of the book. So Breton was kind of a theorist of surrealism. Now, Breton had served in World War I as a hospital orderly, and he had been a firsthand witness to the shocks to the mental system that World War I had created in combatants. So it was not called PTSD back then. It was just called shell shock. And, you got to recover. Sometimes if you had so-called shell shock, they let you stay in a mental hospital for a while, but then they would just send you back to the front. There wasn't really the same understanding of post-traumatic stress disorder that we have now. And certainly there wasn't really, it wasn't really considered a disability that was worthy of being treated, or that people deserve some sort of compensation for. It was just a lot of times um, military commanders thought that soldiers were faking it because they just didn't want to go back to the front. So Duchamp witnessed all that and realized that he would see that his patients had these terrible nightmares, and that there were all sorts of unconscious things going on in their minds in the hospital. And he became really interested in the unconscious mind. Now, if you've taken a psychology course, you no doubt have heard of Sigmund Freud, who more or less single-handedly discovered the unconscious. So it's funny to think that in the late 19th and early 20th century, the idea of the unconscious was not a thing. Like, nobody really knew they had an unconscious mind. But Freud, by analyzing people's dreams and listening to his patients talk, lying on a sort of a daybed in his office, he discovered that, we're not really that rational. Humans are not just brains with reason, that there's all this stuff going on kind of under the surface that most people are completely unaware of. And a lot of that unconscious material only comes out in dreams. So Breton's idea was that it could come out in art through various mechanisms that artists could use to make art that almost illustrated what was going on in the unconscious mind. So this is on the screen here is an excerpt from the Surrealist Manifesto. Psychic automatism in its pure state, by which one proposes to express verbally, by means of the written word, or in any other manner, such as maybe visual art, one proposes to express the actual functioning of thought, dictated by thought, in the absence of any control exercised by reason, and exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern. That is, whatever comes out, comes out. We're not going to censor it and say, oh, that's too shocking, or that's too sexy, or too violent, or whatever. We're just going to set up some processes by which we could access the unconscious mind. And they did it through seances and some other methods that we're going to talk about now. Okay. So one method was what they called, what he referred to as automatism. And in visual art, that meant automatic drawing. And I've experimented a little bit with this. It's kind of interesting. So what you do is you just, without exercising any real choice or plan, you just start scribbling on a piece of paper, and then forms kind of emerge. Like you can see here, there's a hand, and this could be a breast or a fingernail, another hand holding something, and here's another hand holding something. So it seems to be hands. It's sort of turned into a drawing about hands holding things. I mean, is this kind of a sexual thing or what? We don't really know. Masson doesn't know. It's from his unconscious mind. So the surrealists developed a game, actually, a sort of quote unquote parlor game. That is a game you could play with other people, called the Exquisite Corpse. Now, it may not be that easy to see in this picture, but the paper is divided into is folded in four ways. So there's the top, next to bottom, and bottom. So let me just get a piece of paper and kind of show you how to. Well, let me get a clean piece of paper. Okay, so again, when we when we did this class in person, we would do this game and people enjoyed it. So I'm going to show you how. Okay, so you get a piece of paper and you fold it in half. See, I've already folded it in half. Then you fold the top fold in half again. And the bottom fold in half again. So that all you can see, so that you've got a piece of paper that's divided into 4 sections. All right, so the first person, and you play this with 4 people, the first person has the top section. Okay, so she draws a head with some hair maybe. And this is, I mean, you should take more care than this, what I'm doing. But see, I just drew a little head. And then to help you, the next person is not going to see your drawing. You're going to fold it so that they can't see it. But you want to help them a little bit. So you open it up and you draw the neck coming down to the next fold. And then you fold it so that all they see is the little lines that are the neck, okay? So then they draw the rest of the body, like maybe they draw it with wings or something. Like this. Okay, but they don't know what you drew, right? You could have drawn a dinosaur on the top part. All right, so, and then again, you provide a little hint to the next person as to where they should begin. The third person, by putting some little lines there. And then the third person draws, you know, the top part of the leg, maybe. And this is where the third person gets to decide the gender of the person in the picture. I'm going to make mine a lady. But you can make it whatever you want. And then, okay, so I drew that. And then I'm going to sort of extend the legs down a little bit so the next person has a hint as to where to start the feet. Okay, so that would be on this drawing, this part down here. Okay, so the fourth person has to do the feet. And then let's say the fourth person decides they're going to draw flippers. Okay, that's fine. They call her Flipper, Flipper, faster than lightning. Okay, so here's flippers, flippers. Okay, so nobody has seen the whole drawing right yet. But then when you open it up, voila. You have a drawing of a lady with wings and flippers. That's pretty cool. Now, you know, it's perfectly, I just did this in like a minute, but you know, if you've got colored pencils or markers or anything, you can make it much more fancy and interesting, like the artist did in this 1927 exquisite course, which is really great. So when we had the class in person, we had a little contest to see which group would make the best one. All right, so that's automatism, sort of letting go of control over your artwork, either by just automatic drawing or handing over part of the drawing to somebody else, right? You don't have any control what the next person is going to draw on your drawing. So you're trying not to exercise conscious control so much. But another, and that's called chance operations. That is, you know, you leave it up to chance. Another thing that was done by the Surrealists was they would tear up pieces of paper like this, and then this is chance operations again, and then just drop them onto another piece of paper, and wherever they landed, they would glue them down as a sort of collage of chance operations. Okay, so we have automatism, chance operations, and in this slide, found objects. So that's the third sort of way of avoiding conscious rational control over your artwork. So in this is kind of a very early surrealist object. Some people have even put it in the category of Dada, but I don't think it's not as Dada as it is surrealist. So what they would do, Cody wants to come in, hang on, is go to like flea markets or hardware stores, kind of like Duchamp, right? This is sort of like one of Duchamp's ready-mades. So I guess that's the sense in which it's like a Dada object. And maybe, you know, do something to it to make it unfamiliar, or in Freud's terminology, uncanny. That is, it's both familiar and strange. That's the sort of the definition of the uncanny. So, but this may be completely strange to most people, because most of us have not, in the 21st century, have not seen an actual flat iron, an iron. Okay. I'm sure you've seen an electric iron. I mean, most people don't iron very much anymore because all clothes are permanent press or knits or whatever, and we just don't care. But even in my childhood, ironing was a huge part of women's work, you could say, because there weren't that many synthetic clothes or permanent press clothes. Everything had to be ironed. It was all cotton, basically. And if you were a good bourgeois wife, you couldn't send your husband to work in a shirt that had not been ironed, or your children to school in clothes that had not been ironed. I mean, when I was growing up, people even ironed the sheets on the beds, which is crazy. I think people have figured out that's crazy. So ironing was a huge job. It took hours every week to get all this ironing done. But I mean, in the 50s, at least, people had electric irons, but in the 20s and 30s, there weren't electric irons. There were irons that were just made out of iron, and they sat on a wood-fired or coal-fired stove, and they were heated on that stove, and you had to have more than one. You had two or three. And so you would heat the iron on the stove and test it like this. I remember people doing this even with electric irons. They put a little spit on their finger and test the iron like that to see if it was the right temperature. Because if it was too hot, it would burn the clothes, obviously. And then then people sprayed the clothes with water so there would be steam, or they rolled up the clothes and misted them. I mean, there were all these crazy ways to get the clothes damp before you iron. Back before there were steam irons. So it was a pain, you know. Most people sent their laundry out to be done because of this. Okay, but you could buy, and at my grandparents' house, there still are actual irons, you know, made out of iron that were used on these stoves. So that's what this is. This is a pre-electric, non-steam iron, which is just a piece of iron that you heat on a stove and you use to iron shirts and dresses and so on. And then Man Ray has glued carpet tacks, another thing that most people haven't seen lately, to the iron. And the carpet tacks are like nails with a pretty big, short nails with a big head. So he's glued these little tacks on there, and he's named it gift. So this is confusing, right? If you actually gave somebody this, they would be kind of ambivalent, like, thanks. And in fact, Man Ray claims that when he went to the hardware store and got all this stuff to make this object, the guy in the hardware store said, but you're just going to tear the shirt to ribbons. And I don't know what Man Ray said. Something like, it's an art piece or something like that. Okay, so it's both disturbing and familiar. So in that sense, it's uncanny. And what it all means, well, that's kind of what we're going to discuss. We can discuss on Friday, or you can speculate about in your questions, maybe. Like, what does it mean? It's a surrealist object. What does it mean about the unconscious? An unconscious desire to rip clothes to shreds? I can imagine some women actually kind of liking this because they're tired of ironing their husband's shirts. And they're like, yeah, I'm going to rip his shirts to shreds. It would serve him right. So it's kind of like a lot of surrealist objects, it both fulfills, it's a sort of a wish fulfillment while also looking kind of dangerous or unpleasant. Okay, now to understand this, we kind of have to understand what a fetish is. So you probably heard of fetishes. The most famous fetish is a foot fetish. So Broughton did have a little bit of a foot fetish, but we're not going to get into that today. So a fetish in psychology is defined as an object in which conflicting desires converge, like the desire to destroy the shirt and the desire, to iron the shirt. All right, but this I got from a book. Let me show you the book because I refer to it a lot. Are you going back outside? Come on. Okay, so this is my most useful book, and unfortunately, it's backwards, but it says Art Since 1900. It's a great book. I've learned a lot from it. And the editor is a guy named Hal Foster. So this is what he says about fetishes and Freud. And this may sound like really out there to you, but just roll with it for a minute. For Freud, the fetish is a substitute for the penis that the mother lacks. This lack is said to horrify the little boy, for it threatens him with this castration too. And so he turns to penile substitutes, that is, fetishes, to maintain his fantasy of bodily wholeness and of phallic power. So remember that when we get to the Nazi art. Thus, fetishism is a practice of ambivalence, like maybe this, maybe that, in which the male subject both recognizes and disavows castration or any such traumatic loss. This ambivalence splits the fetish into both a memorial to castration and a protection against it. It registers as both hostility and affection. And I think you can see that in the Flatiron thing, maybe. All right, but this is the ultimate surrealist object ever. And its actual name that Merritt Oppenheim gave it is object. But at Vol State, we finally refer to it as the furry teacup. And in fact, one time there was a group that did their presentation on some contemporary artists, and they called themselves the Furry Teacup Group. So you could start a band if you want to, called Furry Teacup. All right, so how did the Furry Teacup come about? Well, Merritt Oppenheim was an art student in Paris in the 1930s. And she was friends with Picasso and Dora Maar. And so one day they were at a cafe in Paris where artists spend a lot of time in Paris. And she had a bracelet on that she had designed, a bracelet covered in fur. And so Picasso said something like, I guess you could cover anything in fur, like, a tea set or something. Teacup. They were having tea, And so Merritt Oppenheim was like, aha. So she bought a tea set and she bought a gazelle pelt. So a gazelle is kind of like a deer from Africa. And she glued, I guess she already knew how to do this from making her bracelet. She glued the gazelle fur onto the teacup and even onto a spoon and onto the saucer. Now, Some of it's sort of fallen off the handle here. Maybe she played with it a little too much and the fur came off. I don't know how she got it to stick on there. And then when André Breton was organizing a show about surrealist art, she submitted this, and Breton pronounced it the perfect surrealist object because it's uncanny. It's both familiar and strange. It's familiar, it's a teacup and a spoon, but it's also really strange. And for Breton, it also had this sort of elements of a fetish. That is, it brings to light some kind of unconscious desires and fears, possibly. So let's read about those. All right, here's what Hal Foster said. Now, to understand, Breton came up with a new name for it, déjeuner en fureur. So what that means is breakfast in furs. All right, so I think you can see where this is going. All right, so it alludes to that the Manet painting, Déjeuner sur l'herbe, luncheon on the grass, right? Late lunch, brunch on the grass. So petit déjeuner is breakfast in French, and déjeuner is lunch or brunch. I think it's sort of like late morning, and dîner is the noon meal. I don't know what they call supper. But in any case, déjeuner en fureur refers to le déjeuner sur l'herbe, that painting of the naked lady and the two men in a park in Paris. But it also refers to a novel that was making the rounds in Paris called Venus in Furs. It was a kind of a porn novel that was popular in Paris in 1936. I've never read it. It's in French. I can sort of read French, but not well enough to read Venus in Furs. But maybe I should read it, try to read it with a dictionary or something. So Breton came up with a new title for object. He called it Déjeuner en fureur, breakfast in furs. And this is what Hal Foster, the guy who wrote that book I showed you, says about it. Déjeuner en fureur is a still life come nude. So it's a sort of a still life, but it's also kind of a nude. How is it sort of a nude? It's a witty disturbance of tea time propriety through a smutty allusion to female genitalia that plays ambivalently, kind of, that means, on oral eroticism as well. So that's a lot to unpack, but I'm not going to unpack it for you. I'm going to let you figure it out. I think you can. All right. Now, the next sentence is a little harder. It also sends up the Freudian fetish, that is, mocks it through excess, as if to fling its masculinist bias in the face of the male viewer. That is, it's a parody of the idea of the Freudian fetish, which is all about penises, according to Freud. Well, you know, what about the other sex? Couldn't there be a fetish about women? Essentially, Merit Oppenheim is saying. One senses, sorry about the typo there. One senses the joy of power reversed in this well-played joke of Venus in furs who delights in her sadistic ploy. Well, I'm not sure how sadistic it is, but it is kind of funny when you think of it that way. So I think you can figure all that out. Sometimes when we talked about this in our in-person class, people didn't want to go there. Like they couldn't quite bring themselves to talk about the oral eroticism here. But I think you can figure it out. And maybe we can talk about it on Friday. Okay. I'm going to skip that one. This is another Merit Oppenheim, another fetish. Okay, so what this is kind of another one of those complicated charts. And you don't really have to buy all of it. But what it does is it kind of unpacks this word, the uncanny, which in German, which is language Freud wrote in, is unheimlich. So if something is unheimlich or uncanny, What does Heimlich mean? So Heimlich has two meanings in German. It means homey, sort of cozy, hygge, you know, but it also means secret and concealed and withheld from sight. So something that's unheimlich is unhomey, uncomfortable, eerie, strange, like the furry teacup, but also no longer secret. That is, it's revealing something that was formerly unconscious or hidden away, like oral eroticism or something like that. So the word uncanny is not an exact translation of what Freud meant by unheimlich, but that's what surrealism is aiming for, you could say, the unheimlich. Okay, and so this is Dali's painting, The Persistence of Memory, is a great example of unheimlich. It's uncanny, it's weird, but it's also kind of realistic. I mean, what's going on here? Okay, so Dali's goal here is to go, Dali's goal generally was to make paintings that looked like very exact transcriptions of weird dreams. Okay, so it has to be kind of real looking. So it's set in a more or less real landscape, right? There's some sort of a cliff back here that goes down to an ocean or a lake and a kind of wasteland or desert. There's some sort of a table here. There's a pocket watch with ants on it, but another pocket watch that has melted in a weird way. There's 4 watches, and then there's this unheimlich kind of creature lying on the ground that could be just a skin of an animal or a slug or a duck or a face. It seems to have eyelashes and a tongue. And then there's this tree growing out of the table, strangely, but it looks like a dead tree. And then in the background, there's just this kind of platform that you can't even see what it is really. So you may be familiar with this painting. It's a pretty famous painting. It's not huge, you know, it's small. A lot of surrealist paintings are kind of small, but it's fascinating, you know, like what's going on here? What is this about? I don't know if you could ever come up with an exact paraphrase of this painting, but you know, you could certainly come up with an interpretation of it. And that's all we can do in visual art is interpret, you know. Some people have said that this is the landscape of Dali's childhood that he grew up in Spain. Some people have said it looks like Dali's face, his nose and his eye. But why are the clocks melting? Why are the ants kind of feeding on the back of this pocket watch? Apparently, why is the tree dead? The whole painting has a kind of feeling of either a very deep sleep or of death, just quiet. Nothing's moving here. Everything, its time has sort of come to a stop. So there's an interesting video in the content that you can look at about where the art historians and Sal Khan discuss this painting. All right, so here's what Dali wrote about his process and his purposes. His purpose was to materialize the images of concrete irrationality with the most imperialistic fury of precision, in order that the world of imagination and of concrete irrationality, that is, dreams, may be as objectively evident as that of the exterior world of phenomenal reality. That is, so Dali kind of came up with this phrase, concrete irrationality, which is kind of an oxymoron in a way, like how can irrationality be concrete? But it is if you make a painting that sort of materializes your dreams or a dream or a fantasy and makes it look real, kind of, with light and shadow, you know, chiaroscuro. The light seems to be coming from over here. So he's been kind of consistent about the light, although there's not much of a shadow for this thing on the ground here. But, the tree's casting a shadow in this direction. The watch has a shadow. I don't know why this shadow is so big. That's a little weird. But I mean, the landscape is more or less convincing, except for these strange things going on in it. All right, so I put this here because this quote from Salvador Dali, because students always say, well, what was going on? Was he just doing drugs or something? And I just don't think it's that simple. And maybe he was, but that's not all there is to it, So he says, I don't do drugs, I am drugs. I think that's a good rejoinder to any accusation that when somebody says, are you on crack? You just say, I don't do crack, I am crack. Okay, so here's now we haven't really talked about Mexican modernism very much, but we have seen some paintings by Frida Kahlo. So Frida, Mexico was having its own kind of art movement of modernism, and part of it was sort of surrealist. And you could say, I think Frida, it's fair to say Frida was a surrealist. I don't know how much she followed the European art and what was going on in Europe at this time, but her whole personality was basically surrealist, sort of illustrating in a very concrete way, as Dali would say, the workings of her own deepest sort of unconscious or mind, almost as if to make it conscious and to learn about herself, I feel like, is part of what her project was. So in this case, the two Fridas, she paints a double portrait of herself. Now that's surrealist to begin with, right? And surrealism did sort of deal in this doubling frequently with photography. In this case, though, it's a painting. So she's drawn two paintings of herself, two images of herself. And this was after her divorce from Diego Rivera. They later remarried, but they broke up for a while in the 30s for various reasons. If you watch the movie Frida, you can find out what the reasons were. But, it was really, she was really loyal to Diego, like even when he betrayed her repeatedly, she loved him, in a way that's sort of hard to understand in some ways because they were so different. He was a lot older than she was. He was probably 3 times her size. She was a little tiny person and he was a gigantic, huge guy. And their personalities were really different. She was really much more introverted than he was, I think. But she just was devoted to him, and they did remarry later. But for a while, they broke up. And so during that period, she painted this self-portrait that's really pretty amazing, I think. Okay, so let's just sort of look at the content of the painting. So it shows her in 2 different styles of dress. Traditional Mexican dress, which Diego liked for her to wear, and European sort of colonial dress, you could say, which is, she wore in the 20s when he met her, she was wearing European style dress, but this is more like Spanish colonial outfit, like something her mother would have worn. And this is traditional Mexican dress. So in this, and in both cases, the heart is exposed, but in this case, it's still sort of under the skin. And in this case, it's like floating on the outside of her dress. So that's pretty surrealist. And she's holding this little portrait of herself and Diego with this hand. And there's like an artery connecting the heart of this figure to the heart of the other figure. But the other figure is holding a little hemostat that's used in surgery to stop blood from flowing through an artery or a vein. And yet its blood is still dripping, sort of talking about it, symbolically illustrating the pain of this separation. So, what's going on here? The indigenous version of Frida and the conquistadora Frida are kind of friends, but the Spanish European Frida is trying to stop the bleeding, you could say. But this Frida is not bleeding, but her heart is just floating outside of her body, almost sort of disembodied. So, this is another painting that we could talk about on Friday, if maybe you could come up with some possible interpretations of it and float those in your question and people could discuss. And what's going on back here? What's the cloudy sky about? Maybe that's kind of obvious. Okay, while all this was going on, the Nazis were trying to stamp it out, basically. So this is Goebbels entering, he was Hitler's kind of art guy, entering the degenerate art show, which before the Nazis, the art in this show had belonged to various prestigious museums in Germany, but they seized 16,000 artworks. They confiscated them from artists, from art museums and various art collections, and put them in the degenerate art show as examples of bad art, like art that you shouldn't like. And then they exhibit in another building nearby, they exhibited official German art, good art. And we'll look at that in a minute too. So Entartete Kunst, or degenerate art, was art that was abstract, that was of surrealist, Dada, anything that smacked of primitivism, which was a kind of form of modernism at that time. And they put art in scare quotes. In other words, this is not really art to the Nazis. And then when they exhibited the art, there were, this is George Gross, who was a Dada guy at first. And actually, here's Hitler and Ziegler. This is about Dada. So these are the words of Gross. Take art seriously. Take Dada seriously. It's worth it. But the show was meant to make fun of Dada and surrealism. So, but the weird thing is that even artists who were Nazis, who had joined the Nazi party, like Nolde, had their work confiscated and declared as degenerate art, like this woodcut by Nolde. And these, but back here you see some paintings by Picasso being held by a curator. He's holding a frame here. And then there's another work on the floor here. Some of these were destroyed or sold for basically nothing after the show closed to American collectors in some cases. Some of it was German expressionism. That was one of the things that Hitler and Goebbels didn't like. I mean, it had been invented in Germany, but they didn't approve of it. So it's hard to say exactly what it was that they hated so much about German expressionism, but they really didn't like it. And weirdly, of the 116 artists in the degenerate art show, only 4 were Jewish. But, apparently Hitler thought that even work made by non-Jews looked Jewish to him. So I talked about this painting a little bit when we had our discussion on Friday. The reason it's in black and white is because it disappeared. It was one of the works that was destroyed after the degenerate art show. But it's a painting by Otto Dix that shows the terrible disfigurements and basically amputations that soldiers came home with after World War I. So this guy has lost both legs and an arm, and his face, his ear is gone. This guy is so jittery, he can't hold his head sort of straight. His head and his hands are shaking, and he has lost a leg. This guy has lost both legs and both arms and an eye. This guy, the bottom half of his face has been blown off, and something that has happened to his eye and his hand maybe. And he's holding a card that says 45% fit for service. So even though people had these prosthetic jaws and prosthetic teeth, and you can see a store that sells prosthetic limbs in the background, they were sometimes deemed fit for service. That is, they could go back to the front, believe it or not. So this is the kind of painting that Hitler didn't like, because, you know, it's a pretty serious indictment of warfare. And Hitler was planning an invasion of Poland and the Ukraine. He didn't tell people that necessarily, but he was. So he wanted to glorify war, not tell the truth about it. So, and the kind of, oh, I don't understand why my fan on this computer is so loud. I hope you can't hear it. Anyway, what was official German art? What was the art that Hitler and Goebbels did like? It was this kind of stuff. This kind of you could call it a kind of neoclassicism, where the figures were ideally beautiful and perfectly proportioned. Arno Breker was one of the sculptors that Hitler and Goebbels did like, because he made these neoclassical sort of idealized Aryan figures. So again, Hal Foster has some interesting things to say about why the Nazis disliked modern art. And so I'm just going to read this aloud to you. Modernist art was dangerous because it privileged the individual in terms of original vision, singular style, personal redemption, and so on. This subjectivism ran counter to the corporate imperative of totalitarian regimes, the need to bind the masses psychically and almost physically to the leader, party, and state. In this scheme, the individual body could only figure the body politic. That is, you couldn't make a statue of an individual. It had to be an image of the government, the state. And the body politic was often imaged as phobically intact, even phallically aggressive, as in Readiness by Breker, an allegorical figure of Nazi militarism. So these sculptures still exist in Germany. I have a friend who teaches German at Tech, and she visited Berlin and Munich recently and saw some of these sculptures there. Okay. Now, somewhat surprisingly, or maybe not, Stalinist art from the same period also is anti-modernist, you could say. It's this is called Soviet socialist realism. So it's classicizing, sort of neoclassical, with idealized figures and heroic sort of postures. It's not about the individual or subjectivity or anything else. It's a kind of form of propaganda, really. Of course, the Nazis saw Stalin's regime as antithetical to their own right-wing totalitarianism, because it was left-wing totalitarianism. So ostensibly, the Nazis and the communists were enemies, but actually they liked the same kind of art. So that's kind of interesting to think about. Again, maybe something to think about to come up with a good question for your question and for Friday. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. So I'm gonna, on Wednesday, we'll be talking about chapter 24, the post-war period, which is really about American art for once. Finally, Americans. So your question should cover either surrealism and the sort of Nazi censorship of modernist art, or the chapter 24 stuff about, mostly about abstract expressionism. That's what I'm gonna talk about on Wednesday. So your question should be about something that's either in the Monday lecture or in the Wednesday lecture. Okay, so that's all I have. And so I'm going to quit now. Bye.